Step two was sort of like seeing not only how churches were treating me, but treated my ex-spouse. We're kind of ready because I was the guy with the Bible degree and she was just, almost disposable to them. There was a lot of rhetoric about how it must have been her fault when I knew deep down it was 100% my fault. And I was kind of like, I saw the fork, kind of start splitting, where it was like, play ball and hang out with the Christians or be a good person. And that sucked because that's not what I didn't want either of those choices, because I loved my faith and like wanted to think that all the years of my life had value and like had mattered and worked towards a goal, and now I can say they did, just not the one I was expecting.
John Verner, thank you so much for coming on the show. I cannot wait to hear about your story, your podcast, your book, your blog, The Cult of Christianity. You have a really unique story. And I want to hear all of it. Like, let's just start from the day you were born. Like, let's just start from the beginning.
Okay. Cool. When I was born, apparently the umbilical cord wrapped around my neck twice, and
oh my god.
Yeah, that's
is that true?
Yeah, that's the legend. I don't remember.
Oh my god.
But
clearly, yeah. Okay, so let's fast forward. Yeah.
We'll fast forward to about 6 days old. I was on my first plane. No. No, the probably the interesting thing to know is I was baptized as an infant into the Presbyterian Church of America, which is a rather conservative denomination of Protestant evangelical, just your basic run-of-the-mill Christianity you'll run into in the United States. But this particular denomination is a little bit more on the heady and traditional side. They would hate if I said this, but think like Roman Catholics, but Protestant version. So they still had
hear you.
They still had robes. They still were pretty formal. We sang out of a hymn book, that kind of thing. And, I was fairly skeptical as a child. I wasn't necessarily just taking everything at face value. I asked a lot of questions, but by the time I was 11, I had heard enough sermons. I had been, I would now say, guilt tripped enough to come to Christ. And, I did convince myself that I had a real spiritual encounter with Jesus. And so because of that, I started confessing my faith, telling my testimony. Some of that probably had to do to some Christian summer camps I was sent to. Some of it probably had to do with like my dad being a leader in this church. But ultimately, once I was 11 and, starting to kind of make that transition from just complete child to young adolescent, my faith became a lot less about doing the right thing and more emotional and relational. And so like I was still wanting to do the right thing, but I really was just kind of on fire for the Lord, if you will. I was wanting to spread the gospel. I thought that was like the entire point of existence, of human existence, was to share the story of Jesus dying and raising himself from the dead in order to save lost souls. And so as that intensified as I got older, by the time I was 17, thinking about career choice, I felt the call. Still can't tell you what that means, but I felt the call to be a pastor. And not wanting to wait to get a different degree and then go get a master's of divinity, which is what a lot of pastors get, at least in my denomination. I found a program at Moody Bible Institute that had an undergraduate degree that was in preaching. So I have that degree, a Bachelor of Arts in Biblical Exposition, and went to Bible college, studied the Bible, studied Hebrew, and studied Christian history, learned ministry tactics, learned how you save the lost and how you feed the flock and all those fun little terms. And throughout all those times, I was certainly having some skeptical questions about the theology, but what bothered me more than theological tensions I would wrestle with, figuring out who this God was more so why are all these people behaving so poorly? Like why are Christians not fun to be around? And keep in mind that, I went to Bible college 2012 to 2016. So at the end of my college years is when we're starting to get into Trump running for his first term. And so there's a lot of crazy rhetoric going on. And I wasn't necessarily surprised that Christians were willing to vote for him. I was definitely surprised they were revering him and like championing him. That was unsettling. And so around this time, I also I met a girl at that college and we ended up getting married. We did not last long. We were divorced about a year and a half later. And part of that experience was really me waking up to not only are those Christians out there terrible, this Christian right here is terrible. And that was starting to really sink in, that I was facing how I was being, emotionally abusive to my spouse, how I was being manipulative in different ministry contexts. And that even though I saw myself as a bit of an outsider, a bit of a liberal in a conservative world in some ways, it was really starting to sink in that some of the brainwashing I was experiencing was actually affecting my behavior to others. And so shortly after my divorce is around the time I started the idea of, am I in a cult, started kind of circulating in my brain. And that question kind of led me to the work I do now, which is compare Christianity to cults. It started with a book that I wrote when I was in a van homeless. That's another story for another time. But it became this whole kind of introspective journey to figure out what I really believe. And then kind of in that process, realizing what I had observed. And what I observed was a pattern of different cult-like tactics my whole life that were used to harm people and teach those people how to harm others, all the while calling it love. And that was obviously a very painful journey, but a very important journey. And the writing the book's not great. I mean, I wrote it more as therapy than anything else. But after that, I wanted to promote the book with a podcast, and that's how I got into podcasting. Realized I loved interviewing people, loved the process of getting into some of these nuances and getting into how people use language in different ways. And so from the podcast, it actually kind of earned me a spot to work on my master's at NYU in journalism. And so now what I'm kind of shifting into a full-time career is investigating different cults and churches, where I go in and I find out what's going on and I report on it. And because I can kind of speak fluent in cult language, I can get pretty far and figure out what's going on. And it's been awesome. It's a wacky redemption arc. It's almost like a redemption arc in the mirror, or a reflection on a lake or something. It's really a weird redemption arc. It's like an inverse redemption arc in some ways, but it's been wonderful. So that's the overview of who I am, I suppose.
I love this journey. I love everything about this. I have, I know I sent you some pre-interview questions before, but now that I've heard this in depth, I have 1,000 more questions. So hopefully we can get to some of this in an hour. So awesome. I want to go back to some of the experiences you had early on in Christianity. So namely, you talked about that experience that I think a lot of listeners are familiar with, of giving your testimony when and claiming to have talking about your faith to the fellow congregants, and then you kind of had this other experience later on. I'm sure when you were going into Bible college, you would probably have to do a profession of faith there as well. Can you talk about what was going on internally with you? Because I know you said you had some skepticism. Did you feel like you were feeling something that you would consider to be a spiritual experience? Or was it like everything externally is making you craft an experience that you weren't happening?
It was 100% spiritual in my mind at the time. There was really no skepticism about my own spiritual experiences. And even in reflecting back, I don't necessarily claim to have it figured out exactly what was going on. I think there was,
sure.
My proclivity is to say I was manipulated, and it was kind of like placebo effects, and kind of
sure.
wanting something to happen, and so convincing yourself it happened kind of stuff. But life is weird, and our subconscious and conscious interact with each other in weird ways, and there's no definitive way to define all of that. But certainly at the time, the skepticism was more like I had a critical mind that could kind of observe the group behavior was off. It was less so about like my internal feelings. And even as I was leaving Christianity, my belief in God was kind of the last thing to get adjusted. The first thing to go was church. The first thing to go was like other Christians, you know.
Sure.
And so, yeah, I definitely think like I wasn't having so much spiritual skepticism as I do now, but more so just skepticism about how these groups work.
Yeah. Yeah, let's talk about the groups then and how they work, because I feel like depending on the flavor of Christianity that you grow up in, you get a different almost
Mm,
lens. So like for instance, I grew up Black Baptist, but not
mhm,
really in the church, more like home, learning a lot of this stuff at home
mhm,
because of my mom's religious trauma. She actually didn't feel comfortable with us really going to church after a certain point, but I still
mm,
got like half of it. And then, in highly spiritual person, I keep meeting these like ex-Catholics, recovering
mm,
Catholics, progressive Catholics. So I'm learning about that perspective. So I know you write about and speak about evangelicalism, but also white evangelicals in
mhm,
particular. Maybe you could kind of give us an overview of kind of what you saw, what you experienced from that lens in that denomination, and just kind of
mhm,
evangelicalism. Like, how does that compare to other flavors of Christianity in the
mhm.
West, let's say?
Ooh, big question. Yeah, I'll do my
Yeah, I
best.
know, I know, I know, I know.
So, yeah, there's a couple things there.
Yeah,
First off, the hardest part is the evangelical bit, because evangelical
yeah,
is a word used in very different ways, especially in recent years than it used to be.
yes,
Um,
yes,
Evangelical, I mean, it's evangelism is like a word that's
yeah.
similar, right? Same root word. And the
Hmm.
idea is just like you're kind of defined by the fact that you evangelize, that you proclaim, that you're like
You go
out to
out, yeah,
convert
yeah.
people. But
Hmm.
what's weird about evangelicalism is that's not really all it is. Evangelicalism
Hmm.
kind of has a bunch of different tenets to it. Another word
Yeah,
that sometimes people will use is fundamentalism. Well, fundamentalism is
yeah,
another one of those words that used to mean one very
yeah.
specific thing, and now it's kind of broadened out. Where I'll
Hmm.
start is I'll say evangelical basically means any kind of Christian that is serious about being a Christian in the US is probably the best way to think about it
Yeah,
for
yeah,
broad strokes purposes. There's a lot of
yeah.
more technical definitions we could get into. I don't think they're worth it half the time. I think it's just to
Sure,
think of
yeah.
evangelical as this kind of the standard Christian you might meet in the United States who takes their faith seriously.
Hmm.
So to basically not
Hmm.
nominal Christians might also fall under evangelicals. Now, there's another way the word's used, which is more politically, which has to do
Hmm.
with kind of like a Republican version of Christianity.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
that's a little bit different than what I'm talking about, but there's definitely a lot of crossover.
yeah.
That's all I'll say about that to start. Then we'll go to the white. So white
Yes, yes.
evangelicalism basically is evangelicalism because it was founded by white people. I mean, that's just kind of
Hmm.
the thing to know. Evangelicalism really started kind of gaining popularity around the founding of this country.
Hmm.
And so, it evolved, and then like kind of evangelicalism as we know it really ramped up during the civil rights era as kind of a counter to civil rights
Yeah, yeah,
stuff. So big figure to know would be Jerry Falwell. If you've heard of
yeah.
his son has gotten in a lot of trouble with Liberty University, but
Yes, I've seen. Yeah,
yes.
that's an
But
interesting story arc. Yeah.
yeah, but the thing to know about his dad is he was kind of the anti MLK in a lot of
Yes.
ways. I mean, he was very outspoken about how MLK is kind of ruining Christianity. So in a lot of ways,
Hmm.
evangelicalism is kind of counter civil rights in its founding.
Yes.
The weirdest thing about evangelicalism is how it rebrands consistently with whatever serves their power, because
Mm.
unlike before the civil rights era, evangelicals were much more passive when it came to political issues, when it came to pretty much anything. They weren't anti-abortion to start. They weren't
Hmm.
like that concerned about those things. Um, and then obviously when the civil rights comes, they kind of use abortion as actually like a scapegoat to try to prevent Jimmy Carter from getting elected, because Jimmy Carter was for desegregation. So
Right. Right.
evangelicalism in its roots is just racist. But here's the tricky part.
Yeah.
You have this other thing going on where a lot of people have used Christianity a lot of non-white people have used Christianity in different eras of history to get through terrible things. Even when the way they learned about that Christianity was from white colonials, like indoctrinating them with it by saying you're a slave because the Bible tells me so.
Right.
But we're able to kind of flip it on its head and find hope in it. So it gets really messy. So the reason I say all that is like there's this idea of black evangelicalism. In some sense, it doesn't exist because all evangelicalism kind of learned things from white evangelicalism. But you got to kind of my perspective would be something along the lines of but I'm not going to speak to all the issues of black evangelicalism because I don't have those experiences, and two, I think there has been some sort of redeeming quality in finding a cultural identity there. It's just I still would challenge any kind of coercive control or any kind of cult tactics going on in those communities. I'm equal in that sense across the board. But where I come from as far as critique goes is based on experience and expertise, and my experience and expertise would be white evangelicalism. That was a lot of words. I hope some of it made sense.
No. I love lots of words. That's why I ask these big questions, because you have to understand. So I a little fun fact about me: when I was in college, so keep in mind, even though I grew up Christian, never read the Bible until I went to college. I went to a Catholic university, and now I'm around Catholics, which I'd also never been around before. There's statues everywhere. There's nuns running around. People are like genuflecting, and I'm like, what is this, right? So it gave me kind of this crisis of faith, and I was like, I need to just see what the Bible says. So I read the Bible cover to cover twice. I started studying biblical Greek and biblical Hebrew. Like, I'm doing this all in my dorm room when everyone else is like partying, drinking, having fun. I'm just like a monk in the dark, like, okay, and what is the Hebrew word? So it's not very often I get to talk to other people who are like way more knowledgeable and actually like were in ministry. So it's like, I'm always just like, tell me about the Greek words, and all this stuff. So no, all of that makes sense. And, to your point about, black evangelicals or the black church, I mean, that there are people who have written, I'm sure, full theses on just like the cultural, political, social, like intertwining of all of this. But like, there's so much critique for the black church. I am very, very critical of just like a lot of practices and things that are still happening in the black church, but it's like you said, you have experience somewhere else, so of course you're going to speak to that more fully. So I appreciate you kind of pointing that out. What I do want to circle back on, though, is just like some of the characteristics that you saw and like some of the behaviors that you're just like, why do other Christians act this way? I want to just kind of hear more about that.
Yeah, so I mean, it can get really basic or really complex. A basic one would be something like, there's no such thing as a pastor in the Bible. So like there's no like go be a pastor of a church. So then I'm like, all churches have pastors. So what happened here? And the reason that's worth pointing out is it's not like there isn't stuff in the Bible about leaders in a church or even
deacons and whatnot,
or some sort of official capacity for some things. But even then, I mean, the Bible's its own cluster. But I would say that like what was strange to me is it was like, why is there authority? Why is there an authoritative figure in churches? And some churches kind of try to do this weird kind of what I would call pseudo accountability type system where they'll be like, we have a board, we have a session, we have a group of elders or something that kind of keep everyone on the level and make sure no one gets too powerful. But in practicality, that's not at all how it works. The pastor runs the show at every church. I mean, like I've never seen an exception to that rule. The pastor is in charge. They'll say they're a servant leader, but how do they do that? I've never seen that actively done. And so that's like kind of one piece you can point to. The next piece is like they get paid. That's also kind of weird because that's not really a thing in the Bible. I mean, you've got give up all your possessions kind of coming up over and over again in scripture. You've got be transient, follow me, like be a nomad to some extent. That's certainly a theme. But you don't really have the pay your pastors well anywhere. You don't have the tithe goes to the pastor's salary anywhere. Tithes are really, in scripture at least, supposed to be about
Alms,
like
yeah.
feeding poor people and taking care of the
Yeah.
widows among you. I mean, like, and
Yes.
even then, that's tricky too, because a lot of that language, once you really diagnose it, is about like protecting the property of these patriarchs. And so like the widows
Right,
and
right, right, right,
orphans are
right.
kind of like, take care of them because they don't have a patriarch to take care of them, and so we need
Right,
to,
right, right.
it gets really messy and really complicated. If you want to get
Yes.
more like kind of relevant to the just anecdotally,
Yeah.
so when I was 16, I, saw a lot of problems in my church, namely that there was a lot of like disrespect. Because my church was so Protestant, they would literally commit hate speech against Catholic people in church.
Oh,
And that
jeez.
was just kind of struck me, and
Yeah,
there were
yeah.
some many other problems. So I wrote a long letter to the pastor in the session asking, for, or just not really just explaining problems I'm seeing. It led to a meeting where it was kind of me versus three elders who kind of,
Oh, wow.
I mean, they just spiritually abused me for 3 hours. I don't really have a kinder way to put it.
3 hours?
It,
3 hours?
it was pretty nuts, and some of the highlights were, my long hair was sinful, hence I have long hair to this day.
Oh my
And then
gosh.
they were saying, that like it was inappropriate for boys and girls to hug each other, because that could lead to,
Wow.
whatever.
Oh, anything, yeah.
Yeah, and then like, like dressing in all black is a sign that you're gothic, like just crazy nonsense.
Oof.
And so that was the first kind of experience where I was like, I need to start being critical of church leaders. And in a lot of
Yeah,
ways, I
yeah.
would look back and say part of my motive for wanting to be a pastor is I want to be better than that. I want to make sure I do it right,
Right,
And
right,
while that
right.
motive might be rather wholesome, it quickly turned pretty bad, because that's how these power mechanisms work. And that's really the crux of my
Yeah,
observations is you put anyone in that kind of position of power, they end up
yeah.
harming. When there's no
Mhm,
when the guise is you are in charge of people's spiritual worth, you're going to do
mhm.
something bad. You just are,
Yeah,
on purpose or not. You might be kind of more sociopathic and take advantage of people, or you might
sure.
be have good intentions, but the pressures of that system and of that theology will still lead you to cause harm.
Mhm.
And I really
Yeah,
couldn't get around
yeah.
that. I kept trying to get around it, and there really
Yeah,
was no way around it. And that's how I ended up being an abusive person myself. And how
yeah.
I ended up, being pretty uh contained, having narcissistic tendencies to some extent, not being able to
Yeah.
see outside myself, and I
Mhm.
think that is what those kind of ideologies breed.
Yeah. Yeah, so it sounds like you're saying the system itself is so flawed that it kind of pushes people into these really unsavory
Hmm.
behaviors, unsavory, characteristics.
Hmm.
Maybe, we could talk a little bit about just your view on how like cult characteristics specifically, because I know
Hmm.
that a lot of your work is around pointing out those parallels, and
Yeah.
these are probably things that a lot of, like, you would call nominal Christians or everyday
Mm.
Christians are probably not aware of, that there are churches and huge pockets of Christianity that would actually fit that criteria. So like, what is that criteria, and
Mhm.
what specifically, where have you seen that?
Great question. Love to talk about this. So
Yeah.
the first thing to point out is the word cult is subjective. So like,
Yes.
this is an opinion, but it is,
Mhm.
in my opinion, an analysis. So it's a little stronger than an opinion, because I have observed data to formulate this opinion. I don't just kind of think it for
Mhm.
fun.
Mhm.
So I define a cult, and there are other good definitions of a cult, but mine is, where a cult is when leaders control, contain, convert followers. That's like the
Mhm.
short version of it. And the reason I do it that
Mhm.
way is it's a little open ended, and I would rather think of it rather than like a strict legal definition kind of thing. But I would rather think of it more like indicators. So, like,
Mhm.
if your group has a sharp distinction between leaders and followers, that's where to start. If it's like
Mm.
this guy is the leader, this guy is a follower, that's kind of a already red flag, Because,
Yeah.
and what I
Yeah.
mean by that is all groups have leaders kind of innately. It's something we just do as
Mhm.
humans. But what we
Sure.
don't always do is make it so clear and distinct that the person is almost forced to assume the role.
Gotcha.
What I mean by that is like, the Catholic Church, one indicator that might be working against them is the leaders dress differently than the followers. That's like,
Mm.
like a clear like indication like that I'm dressing different than you. Where it works
Mhm.
out more
Mhm.
practically in my neck of the woods in white evangelicalism is
Mhm.
there's you'll see it all the time that if a leader commits a sin versus a
Mhm.
follower committing a sin, they are treated differently. So like
Yeah.
a leader committing a
Yeah.
sin, for better or worse, right? But like a leader could lose their leadership role, or they
Mhm.
could have it swept under the rug, more often happens.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
it could be like we have sort of a special group that we have resources to help this guy. But if a follower commits a sin, they might
Mhm.
face excommunication. They might have to leave that church.
Yeah.
They might be
Yeah.
publicly shamed, told to go up before the church and explain themselves. These are
Yeah.
very common things. And so even that different treatment between leaders and followers just reinforces that distinction. That's one.
Mhm.
We got three more to go. So control is kind of the obvious stuff, I would say, to most people,
Yeah.
that the obvious red flag stuff. If you got somebody saying
Yeah.
you must do this, and then like if you don't do it, there's consequences, that's pretty controlling.
Sure. Sure.
And one way to think about it is, are they controlling the behavior you're getting? Are they controlling the information you're getting, saying don't read that book, do read
Mm.
this book, that kind of thing.
Sure. Sure.
It could be controlling your diet, controlling what you wear is a big one. Does everyone kind of
Yeah.
dress the same at your church? Those kind of things. It doesn't have to be super
Mhm.
like formal and ritualistic. It doesn't have to be everybody's wearing robes or has like headpieces. It can be as simple as everyone is literally wearing the same like H&M flannel or whatever,
Mm.
whatever it
Yeah,
might
yeah,
be.
yeah.
It can look like that. When we go to contain, that's us versus them is the short way to think about that. So like any
Got
kind
it.
of
Yeah.
language that says we're this group, they out there are that group, that's a big red flag for a cult. That's
Yeah.
like just what it does is it reinforces superiority complexes, messiah complexes,
Yeah.
persecution complexes. And it's sometimes sometimes not intentional, but most often very,
Sure.
very thought out to be like,
Yeah.
so for example, my church saying Catholics are the bad Christians is a
Right.
cult tactic because it's saying we're the
Yeah.
good ones, they're the bad ones. And then the last one is conversion, and that one's a little weird because obviously
Mm.
evangelicalism, that's easy to spot because that's the whole shtick, right? We're going to convert the whole world. We're going to take Christ to the whole
Yeah.
world. But not all cults are like that. There's a lot of cults that are very isolationist, especially if you think of some of the more infamous cults throughout history
Mhm.
that like,
Oh, yeah.
end in maybe suicide or like something to that effect, like these groups that kind of retreat from the world. But what I mean by
Sure.
conversion is they have a mechanism. There's no such thing as a single
Mm.
person cult, right? The
Right,
idea
right,
of a
right,
cult
right.
is I have methods to convince you what I'm saying is true. And that's
Yeah.
definitely true in pretty much all facets of Christianity, but especially the evangelical variety, is there are
Yeah.
mechanisms for converting people.
Yeah.
And that's in other cults as well. So that's my
Yeah.
long-winded explanation of my very short definition of a cult.
No, that is so helpful. And as you were, not to get like too far on a tangent, but like as you were explaining that definition, I
Mhm,
realized that a lot of American culture seems to kind of fall into that. Like I can think of jobs I've been at, or
mhm,
like, everybody who has friends and remembers somebody that's like, "Hey, do you want to sell this pyramid scheme thing?" Like all there's a lot
mhm,
of things that have
mhm,
these characteristics that aren't necessarily religious, but they might be a
mhm.
company, they might be financial, they might be political, but that have those same characteristics. And it's like I'm a little uncomfortable now that I'm like, this feels pervasive.
Yep. Now we're cooking with
Okay,
gas.
yeah.
Yeah, this
Uh,
is the way to think, in my opinion. It is
yeah.
daunting. It can be really like, whoa, like this gets big quick. One time someone asked
Yeah.
me if I make a distinction, like what's the difference between a cult and an institution, right? Because we could say
Okay.
something like, is the government a cult? Well, that feels wrong to say, right?
Right,
Because
right,
that's like,
right.
and it should feel wrong to say to some extent because it doesn't quite add
Yes.
up. But
Right.
the main difference I make between like maybe an abusive institution and a cult is institutions are a little less personal. So
Okay, yeah.
so a good workplace is a great example. If you could have a job at Walmart that is awful and has like abusive
Mhm.
tactics and kind of has the features I was just describing. But you could also work at a
Mhm.
mom and pop store and have those same kind of negative experiences. So Walmart, its
Yeah.
problems are gonna probably look a little more institutional since Walmart is just so institutional and it has
Sure,
like such
sure.
huge policy and it's so big and so trickle down. But no, the
Yeah.
CEO of Walmart doesn't know who their employees are. And
Yeah.
like the government example, I don't even know who all my representatives are. I can't name them all.
Right.
But in a mom and pop shop where everybody knows everybody and it's kind of that intimate sort of like pseudo
Yeah.
family that becomes like so toxic. That's kind of the
Yeah.
more of the image I would add. And Christianity kind of falls somewhere on both ends of those.
Yeah.
It's kind of the interesting thing to me about Christianity is it's kind of that entire spectrum of impersonal and
Yes.
personal. There,
Yeah.
there isn't really such a thing as being a Christian without some sort of personal relationship with other Christians. And
Mhm.
there's not really such a thing as a Christianity that hasn't resulted from very institutional uh um outworkings,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a good point. I would love to talk about actually connections and relationships a little bit because you, I mean, you gave us such a great, overview of your entire life story, which I appreciate. I love. But I want to make sure we talk about like the actual transition
Mhm.
from you being in ministry and married to like looking at yourself and then having this shift. So, I mean, what happened during that time? Did you like
Mm.
what fell away first? Like how did you get through that whole journey?
Yeah, it's a mess. So the first thing that happened was coming home to divorce papers. That was
Oh
kind of step
wow.
one, and we never talked about getting divorced or anything, and so like it was kind of like
Mhm.
a whoa, what's gone wrong? I can look back now and
Yeah.
tell you a lot went wrong. But I would say that
Eh,
part of it was I was in denial. I mean, I was just so in
Yeah.
denial about what life actually looked like and just kind of had my head in the clouds. And in some ways I was
Yeah.
able to do that because I was like, I'm just trying to do the best for God. And as long as I can just stay focused on that, everything else can fall away. But as long as I'm focused on that, it'll be
Sure.
okay. So after that, the first instinct was not for me to leave everything. The first instinct was to cling to my faith harder and, pray even
Yeah.
harder and cry even harder and all those things. So that was kind of step one. Step two was sort of like seeing not only how churches were treating me, but treated my ex-spouse. And
Mm,
we're kind of ready because I was the guy with the Bible degree and she was just, almost disposable to them. There was a lot
right.
of rhetoric about how it must have been her fault when I knew deep down it was 100% my fault. And
Wow. Yeah.
I was kind of like I saw the fork, kind of start splitting where it was like play ball and hang out with the Christians or be a good person.
Right.
And that sucked because that's not what I didn't want either of those choices because I loved my faith and like wanted to like,
Right.
think that all the years of my life had value and like had mattered and worked towards a goal.
Yeah.
And now I can say they did, just not the one I was expecting.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, so that was kind of the start, and then I ended up becoming quite a bit of an alcoholic. I was
Mm.
drinking what money I had left. Ended up homeless, was couch surfing. And was like it was just dark. I mean, it was just dark times. There's weeks of
Mhm.
memory I don't have from that summer. Just because I was drinking and traumatized. Um,
Yeah.
and so eventually I was able to get a van that I moved into, and that was in
Mhm.
Washington State, and I'm in Atlanta now, which is where I'm from, and I started my journey from Washington State back to Georgia. And
Wow.
that journey was super introspective. There were a lot of screaming at God at the ocean kind of moments.
Yeah.
There was a
Yeah.
lot of reading poetry, reading different kind of uh I don't know, I guess you could say just like different, more introspective type literature.
Yeah.
And really trying to figure out who I was, what I believed, and that's when I started writing the book while I was in that van. And the book was, the
Yeah.
Cult of Christianity: How Churches Control, Contain, Convert. Like in my head, I just saw it. I was like, I could see all my life at once in some sense. and was like, could just see those recurring patterns over and over and over again. And I just had to write them down,
Yeah.
to get them out.
Yeah.
And so even
Yeah.
by the time the book published, which was like Christmas Day 2019,
Mm.
um, I was still it was hard for me to say I'm not a Christian. Like that was still really hard for me to
Right.
say even after publishing a
Yeah.
book that's pretty inflammatory. Um it was hard for
Yeah.
me to like say those words, so it was definitely
Sure.
a process, but
Uh,
as each year goes on, I just get more confident that I made the right decision, and that
yeah.
truly what I experienced was rough. So yeah, as far
Yeah.
as like the inner workings, the connections, like how it all deconstructed, it's kind of hard to explain because in some ways it was all at once, and in some ways it was
Yeah.
gradual. So,
Yeah.
it was just, but I think the ultimate answer was I wasn't looking for anyone else to tell me what to believe anymore. And
Yeah.
that was the big thing, was like I can just figure out what I believe without anybody's help, without anybody telling
Mhm.
me do this, try this, do this, and like,
Yeah.
um, and then eventually I did go to therapy, and that kind of helped a lot more. But like
Yes,
that
yes,
was the
yes.
that was the starting point.
Yes, therapy is key, and figuring out what you believe without anybody else telling you is absolutely key.
Mhm.
Do you talk to anybody that you were pastoring with, any churches, like anybody from that life?
Other people who've left. There's
Other
a
people who've
couple.
left, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, no, I mean, I still have Christian friends.
Yeah.
They're, I mean, frankly, not as close as my non-Christian friends. I
Yeah.
think that's a little
Yeah.
more on them than me. Um,
Mhm.
but yeah,
Yeah.
I was a little surprised. I thought there was gonna be more backlash after the book. I mean, now I get hate mail daily, but like,
Oh,
you know,
nice.
it was
Yeah.
but mostly from strangers. I haven't had too many negative
Yeah.
things from people who knew me. Some even
Yeah.
positive.
Yeah.
But it there's a disconnect. I mean, a lot of these people believe I'm going to hell. That's kind of hard to
Right.
like form a meaningful relationship with somebody who thinks you're going to suffer forever for not believing what they
Right.
believe. I mean, that's a hard
Right.
thing to get past.
Yeah.
But I'm
Yeah.
open to it. I'll talk to anyone who believes anything. It's just a
Yeah.
matter of how close you could get to them.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I'm totally open to, talking to anybody, but I feel like um the more, for lack of a better term, conservative somebody is,
Hmm.
the less likely they seem to want to talk to me about it, or, it's the people who leave like really nasty comments on
Hmm.
my YouTube channel saying like this is heresy. I want to be like, my whole life is heresy. Like, well, yeah, okay. Like, what is that supposed to stop me?
Right.
Like, yeah,
Right.
that's yeah, nothing about me
Correct.
is
Yeah.
typical. Like what do you want me to do? Like,
Correct.
okay, like sorry,
I
but
I am by
anyway,
definition I am by definition an apostate. So like, I
right.
don't know
Like
what to tell
I
you.
am like
Yeah.
I'm a heretic in basically every Christian
Yeah.
denomination, and I'm sure most other religions. But anyway, maybe do you want to talk a little bit about just like what your spiritual views are now, if
Mhm.
any? Are you an atheist? Do you have a theistic view? Do you not even want to think about any of that anymore? Like, what do you think?
Closest to the last thing you said, but I would say that
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I would say I've said a few. I've said there's been conflicting reports, all purported by me. So I've said I'm spiritually skeptical before.
Yeah,
And then I've recently I stole this from somebody. Her name's Tia Leving. She's great. She's just
yeah.
an anti-fundamentalist writer. She's wonderful, but she says she's
Mhm.
spiritually private, and I really think that's a good way to
Mm.
say it.
Yeah.
Because to me, I can expand more. This is a very loosey goosey, means almost nothing kind of view. But truly, I believe the more you talk about spirituality, the less valid it is. um,
Right, right,
because I
right.
think the second you start attaching words to it, like, what are we doing? Like then it's like,
Yes.
and so that's kind of where I start from. I'm comfortable with spiritual concepts. I'm like feel
Mhm.
somewhat fluent in them.
Yeah.
But I'm always looking for the group dynamics, and I'm always skeptical. Like I'm always, if
Yeah.
somebody, it can be as and to be make a very very clear distinction. I don't care what anyone personally believes. I really don't. I
Yeah.
think anyone should
Yeah.
be able to believe. I mean, and not, this isn't meant to be insulting, but like anyone can believe in Santa Claus if they want to. I just don't care.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like that, it
Exactly.
doesn't
Yeah.
matter to me.
Yeah.
What I
Yeah.
care about is if they start, teaching their kids about Santa Claus, and I'm like, do I care that much? Maybe, maybe not. But what
Right.
are they doing? Are they doing it to control their kids, to make them, like, behave better? I start
Right.
feeling a little icky about that.
Right,
You
right,
know,
right.
and, like, and that's the true with anything. Like, if people enjoy reading about their zodiac sign, that's wonderful. If people wanna
Yeah.
say, "I'm a Taurus, so you definitely blah, blah, blah," I start getting
Right, right, right.
uncomfortable.
Right.
And so, like,
Yeah.
that's kinda where I sit spiritually, is, it's not like I really care how anyone acts with, their spirituality. I'm
Yeah.
curious about how it works out in their group dynamics.
Yeah, I think that's a completely fair distinction, and I think just in at least American culture, we seem to be not used to or like uncomfortable with the idea of personal spirituality. Like it
Mm.
always feels like it needs to be in the context of a group. So I absolutely get where you're coming from because like I don't think we're used to just like, hey, everybody gets to just believe or think whatever. You don't have to
Right.
like be in another group to be able to enjoy your own spirituality. Like that's new, I feel like, for a lot of
Well, and
people.
that's what's really interesting. I think you're right. You're definitely pointing at something, and that's that
Yeah.
that like the one, we're a very hyper individualized culture in general, but it
Yes.
is
Yes.
odd that we like a very simple sentence that I feel like should not be controversial is no two people have ever imagined God in the same way. Ever.
It's
Like,
very
like,
true. Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
impossible for two people to have the exact concept of God, whether they're visual or not
Yeah.
visual, whether they're,
Right.
thinking, no two people have pictured the same thing. But what they have done
Exactly.
is said the same dogma, the same cliches, the same, like,
Right.
languages that are used. So I do think that you're right, that, like, we're somehow uncomfortable, and some of this is actually Christianity's doing, in my opinion. They've
Yeah.
raged against personal spirituality. They've said this has to be
Yeah.
communal. This has to be
Yes.
under this template. This has to be this kind
Yeah.
of way. And it's just not
Yeah.
true, obviously. I mean, because at the end of the
Yeah.
day, no matter what they say, deep down inside, everyone,
Yeah.
even if you're not a spiritual person, that kind of is your own personal take. And so, like,
Mhm.
that's like everyone has their personal sensibility to spirituality, I suppose you could say.
That's 100% it. No, I definitely agree with you. I want to make sure we spend a little bit of time talking about your current work because I know you said
Mm.
that you're studying journalism and you're able to. You didn't use this word exactly, but basically speak Christianese. So
Mhm.
you're able to like kind of get into spaces that maybe other people can't. Can you talk a little bit about what that work is now that you're doing?
Yeah, I'm a little crazy. So I graduate soon with my master's in journalism.
Nice.
I do hard work investigating the institutions, cults, religions, the whole kit and caboodle. Um
Yeah.
and yeah, so some of the stuff I've done has been like going to church. Some of the stuff I've done is seen
Hmm.
like how faith leaders in activist spaces like interact with politics. I've done some work on that. But like I also do things that aren't necessarily Christian. I've done a story where I went into a Scientology church to try to get recruited and recorded the whole thing.
Oh wow.
And like I do kind of crazy stuff like that. And
Yeah.
it's in some sense I think the point of all of this work that I do is to try to highlight something that's really undercovered, that because of the way our laws are set up in this country, if you claim to be religious, you can get away with a whole lot that you could
Yeah.
never get away
Yeah.
with if you didn't claim to be religious. Um,
Yeah.
and so like the only way to really hold those places accountable is by like going in and like writing
Hmm.
about it and or talking about it on a
Yeah.
podcast or what have you. There isn't really, if we only, this is something I'm passionate about. It shouldn't just be on the victims of these abuses to like try to
Hmm.
change things. That's actually
Yeah.
kind of awful to put that on victims of this kind of abuse, to like
Yeah. Yeah.
they have to just keep telling their story over and over again till one day someone will care. Some of us need to
Sure.
just go in there and start holding these people accountable, by like
Mhm.
figuring out what they're doing, interviewing them, calling them out when they're doing things that are not okay, whether they're
Yeah.
legal or not. So like my most
Yeah.
recent investigation I published, I looked at over 180 student handbooks at Christian colleges, and
Mm.
just looked at the rules that were in those handbooks that students had to follow. And,
Yeah.
like, some of them have to take pregnancy tests in order, and some of them have
Oh my
to
god.
some of them are only allowed, 1 earring per ear. Some of them are, not allowed to wear leggings. Some of them, most of them are not allowed to be gay. These are huge
Yeah.
things that like
Yeah.
would not be legal at a state school, wouldn't even be legal at
Right.
a lot of private schools if they received federal
Yeah.
funding like these colleges do. They receive
Yeah.
taxpayer dollars. So like just to really paint that picture, to be very clear, queer people in the US are paying taxes that are going to schools that forbid people from being queer. That's just a reality
Yikes.
that we're just all kind of
God.
passively accepting. And
Yeah.
so so that was my last investigation. So I do the big picture stuff, I do
Mm.
the little picture stuff, but I think
Yeah.
it needs to be talked about a lot more, and I'm happy to make it my career, and maybe one day it'll
Yeah.
actually make me more money than it does now. Right now
Yeah.
it's more of
Yeah.
a work of passion and a work of something I just want to do because it needs to be done.
Yeah, well, I'm sure, I wanted to say that you're doing the Lord's work, but I guess it's probably more appropriate to say you're doing humanity's work.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah, it's,
yeah.
helping people. All right, well, I want to talk about just like what advice do you have to people who are struggling with this kind of stuff, who are maybe realize that the church or community that they're in isn't exactly healthy, or they see these characteristics in themselves? Like what advice do you have for
Mhm.
those people who are questioning this kind of stuff?
Yeah. My standard go-to is take a month off church. I mean, like, if you're still going to
Mm,
church, take a month off church. Don't tell anyone.
yeah.
Don't make a big thing of it.
Yeah.
Just take a month off church and just
Yeah.
one, observe how you feel and see how others react.
Yeah.
Because it might be the case. There's a chance that you take a month off church, you miss it, you want to go back, and you feel refreshed. That's your kind
Yeah.
of worst case scenario in some ways.
Yeah.
Best case scenario, or worse, depending on where your head is at, is that you
Mm,
realize you're in a cult.
yeah.
And so, I think that's the simple practical advice. The more kind of nebulous, just if you want to call this wisdom, I'll call it wisdom. I don't know that it is,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I am a big believer in being insanely introspective in these times. Don't just listen to some sort of deconstruction influencer. Don't if you
Mhm.
need resources and you need community, that's great. I'd actually encourage you to find
Mhm.
community that has nothing to do with any of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Expand your horizons if you need community, but internally, just be so introspective. Don't reach for the
Yeah.
Bible. Don't reach for someone who you trust in the like online space, or an author
Mhm.
you love just so much. Reach in, like
Yeah.
really figure out what's going on inside, because I think that's the better starting place, because it's so easy
Mhm.
to cult hop is what we call it, to go,
Yeah.
I had this really rough time with this group, I'm gonna leave it. And then this group's like, oh, you know what we do to
Yeah.
counter all of that, we do this, this, and this, so we're nothing like that group. And then you join that
Right.
group, and then the cycle continues, because 3 years later they're all the like smoke and starts to fall and you start realizing who they are.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, just be in your own head for a bit and just be calm. And then of course, if you're willing to try, I do recommend trying therapy. I don't necessarily think it's for
Yes.
everyone, but it is 100% for everyone to try. Just to see
Yeah.
if it's right for them. So, and therapy can look different. I used to do activity therapy where my therapist and I would go on walks. So it wasn't so
Ugh.
clinical where you had to like sit and
Yeah.
talk and wallow.
Right,
It's
right.
what it felt like to me
Right.
sometimes. So find the thing that works for you. If you're into art, find the art that works for you. But it's a time to be
Yeah.
introspective for sure.
Yeah, that is amazing advice. And I can say with the advice around taking a month off from church, I did the same thing, and it's funny, the church that I was leaving was actually a Unitarian Universalist church, so, like,
Imagine
considered to
that.
be, like, a liberal
Hmm.
church. I took
Hmm.
the month off, and, one of the members came looking for me, came to my house, unannounced, and, I was in my early 20s, they talked to my
Hmm.
parents, they asked my mom why I'm not coming to church anymore
Wow.
and all this stuff, and, yeah, that was my signal that I was like, I gotta wrap up this
That
story.
is such a
Yeah.
good example. Goodness gracious. The
Yeah.
the thing that sticks out to me about that example is like
Yeah.
that, yeah, you would think Unitarian, cool. Like like
Right,
great. There's
right,
no
right, right.
dogma here. But that's what I'm
Exactly.
talking about. I'm not talking about the ideologies, the theology, the like belief about spirituality even. I'm
Yeah.
talking about the group dynamics, and like
The
that
yeah,
illustrates
characteristics.
the toxicity of that group. So
Yeah.
good on you for
Yeah.
figuring that out.
Yeah. it can happen truly anywhere.
Yeah, it can. I agree.
Yeah. So John, how do you want to work with people? How do you like? Do you want people to just read your book? Do you want them to? Is there other ways they can interact with you? How can they find you?
Well, don't. No. I'm just kidding. Just
Don't
just
contact John.
forget you heard any of this and move on with your day. But
Right.
if you must, you can probably the easiest thing to go do is either go to my website, which is jverner.com, or even if you're more interested in the podcast specifically as it enters into its last season, you can go to the cultofchristianity.com and learn all about that work. And somewhere buried in there, you'll find my awful book. And somewhere in there, you'll also find my awesome investigations. So yeah, if you want. And then I'm on Threads is my main social. You can definitely find me on Instagram and TikTok too. But I love Threads. It's like dark Twitter. I like it. So feel free
It
to
is.
hop on
Yeah, it's
Threads.
like underground. It's like underground Twitter. Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
really great way to put it. Well, John, this was such an amazing conversation. I'm gonna like try not to email you about like biblical Hebrew questions
Oh,
that have been
please
sitting in
do.
my mind
It's
for
fine.
10 years.
Please do
Awesome,
anytime.
awesome. Thank you so much for coming on the show. This was great.
Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Highly Spiritual Person podcast. I really hope you found this conversation inspiring and uplifting. If you did, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel for more updates. And remember, sharing is caring, so if you think others would benefit from this content, don't hesitate to share it with your friends and family. We'll be back with more exciting content, so stay tuned and stay curious.